My Lords, I'd like to begin by thanking the Leader of the House, the Noble Lord True, for delivering on the promise that he gave the House that this debate on the Intelligence and Security Committee report would take place in your Lordship's chamber. But let me also thank the Noble Earl for the way in which he opened the debate, and the Noble Lord Armid of Wimbledon, who will wind up for the government at the conclusion of our debate. All the speeches made so far speak for themselves. They show the breadth and the depth of the knowledge about these issues in your Lordship's House. I should declare some non-financial interests as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea, as vice-chair of the All-Party Groups on Uyghurs and Hong Kong, and as a patron of Hong Kong Watch. And as it's been referred to, I'm not sure whether it qualifies as an interest, but others have referred, and for the purpose of transparency I should say, that I've been sanctioned, of course, by the People's Republic of China and for good measure by Iran now as well. My Lords, this debate is taking place at a time of great darkness in the world, and it's against the backdrop of Putin's illegal war in Ukraine and the Hamas terror attacks in Israel. Putin and the Chinese Communist Party chairman Xi Jinping have told us that they have, and I quote, no limits in their partnership. Both Xi and Putin are aligned with Khomeini in Iran, whose theocratic regime has been bankrolling and arming Hamas and Hezbollah. And not to be outdone, in recent weeks, North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un has delivered millions of artillery shells and rockets to Russia for use in Ukraine. China and North Korea have a mutual aid and cooperation treaty signed in 1961, which is currently the only defence treaty either country has with any nation. I've written to the Noble Lord, the Minister, Lord Armid, about a decision taken only last week by the PRC to repatriate forcibly, in contravention of the 1951 Convention on the Treatment of Refugees, North Koreans who have been sent back to Pyongyang. And I wonder if the Noble Lord can tell us whether that's an issue that we will be raising in the United Nations Human Rights Council, to which the People's Republic of China, ironically, was re-elected just a few days ago. Beyond North Korea, this new and deadly axis wants to replace the rules-based order which has been referred to by the Noble Lord Howe, by my noble and gallant friend, by the Noble Lord Alderdice, and of course the Noble Lord Collins, and wants to replace it and the global stability that has been delivered pretty well since World War II by rule by force and rule by diktat. Now, it would be a mistake to see this alliance of dictators, theocrats, authoritarians and jihadists as separate threats. Their ideological differences will be parked temporarily as they use one another to pursue their shared hatred of the free world and its democracies. Xi Jinping sees us as weak and has frequently attacked Western values and multi-party democracy. His declared ambition is for the CCP regime to become the dominant world power by 2049, when his Communist Party will be 100 years old. Dictators protect one another, and they exploit geopolitical chaos. She thinks nothing of making alliances and deals with Iran, or for that matter, with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And simultaneously, he secures the compliance of dependent countries, a point that's also been referred to by earlier speakers, by indebting them through Belt and Road projects and then demanding the votes of those countries at the United Nations. And that too has implications, of course, for global order and security. And I'd be particularly keen to hear what assessment the Noble Lord the Minister is making of the CCP's current activities across Africa, a point which has been made in the International Relations and Defence Select Committee, on which I was proud to serve with my noble and gallant friend, but regularly by the Noble Lord Botang, who is in his place at the moment. It's against this disturbing international backdrop that the House is considering some of the key observations of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Let's remember what that report begins with these words: China's national imperative continues to be the continuing dominance and governance of the Chinese Communist Party. However, its ambition is at a global level to become a technological and economic superpower on which others are reliant, that represents the greatest risk to the United Kingdom. It explores what it calls, I quote, the multifaceted nature of the intelligence threat posed by China, and warns us that China pursues a whole-of-state approach, meaning that Chinese state-owned and non-state-owned enterprises, as well as academic and cultural establishments and ordinary Chinese citizens, are liable to be willingly or unwillingly co-opted into espionage and interference operations overseas. I close the quote. Most alarmingly, though, for me, my Lords, the committee concludes that China has been able to successfully penetrate every sector of the UK's economy, that Chinese money was readily accepted by His Majesty's government with few questions asked, and that external experts concluded very strongly that HMG did not have any strategy on China, let alone an effective one. The lack of action to identify and protect UK assets from a known threats was, the report argues, a serious failure, and on that the UK may feel the consequences for years to come. Furthermore, the committee found there is no evidence that government departments tasked with countering Chinese interference have the necessary resources, expertise, or knowledge. The level of resource dedicated to tackling the threats, quote, has been completely inadequate, and the slow speed at which these strategies and policies are developed and implemented leaves a lot to be desired. The committee's added that without swift and decisive action, a nightmare scenario could emerge where China represented not just a commercial challenge, but an existential threat to liberal democratic systems. This isn't hawk speaking of the kind that have been referred to in the preceding speech. This is a serious committee of Parliament that is saying this. My Lords, in its response, published last month, His Majesty's government pointed out the committee's inquiry related to evidence primarily presented in 2020, and the government integrated review of the security defence development foreign policy in 2021 and its refresh in 2023, referred to, of course, by the Noble Earl, strengthened the United Kingdom's position on China, recognising what it calls epoch-defining and systemic challenge posed by China, making clear that national security will always come first, and that was echoed by the Noble Earl. So I welcome progress, and I look forward to hearing from the Noble Lord, the Minister, what it actually means, as the Noble Lord Collins said in his contribution. What does it mean in terms of practical actions? And I believe even since 2021 anyway, there continued to be inconsistencies, mixed messaging and inadequate responses on the part of the government to the threats posed by the CCP regime. What is not in contention, and here again I echo what the Noble Earl said in his remarks, is that it's perfectly possible to admire the people, the culture, the civilization of China while opposing the brutal dictatorship that rules China and currently ruled by Xi Jinping. But that is not the position of the government, which pursues a sort of push-me-pull-you approach worthy of Dr. Doolittle and believes you can make more trade deals with a regime accused of genocide against Muslim Uyghurs. That approach was in evidence against this week in reports about the reconvening of JETCO. Wouldn't it be better to reduce our dependency on a regime which we have a trade deficit with, and this is the point the Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed often makes, of around £40 billion, and increase our own resilience, especially in manufacturing, and the enhancement of trade with countries that broadly share our values and beliefs, and here I echo what the Noble Lord Howard Guilford, said about the importance of the Commonwealth, instead of which, my Lords, we ignore the threats and seek deals with a regime which despises and threatens the world. This is a regime that is intensifying atrocities in Tibet, a regime that dismantled Hong Kong's promised freedoms and autonomy in total breach of the international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, a regime that stands accused of severe persecution of Christians and Falun Gong practitioners and other minorities, of committing the crime against humanity of forced organ harvesting, and of unleashing a crackdown on civil society, lawyers, bloggers, journalists and dissidents across China. It's a regime that has escalated threats to Taiwan, a regime that at least twice in the past year has been accused of infiltrating this very Parliament with influencers and alleged spies. It's a regime that the head of the MI5 has on multiple occasions, and as my noble and gallant friend said in his remarks as recently as this week, described threats to British business, warning that the region poses a significant threat. The writing has been on the Great China Wall for years. Recall that in 2020, the government was poised to invite the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei into our 5G network. Now, the Noble Earl made a virtue of the decision not to proceed with that, but it was only as a result of amendments here and a serious rebellion in the House of Commons, combined with pressure from our allies in the United States, Australia and others, who saw the dangers. It was only then that the government changed its mind. That failure to act, in concert with our allies, cost this country significant sums of money and damaged its reputation. And the same thing has happened with Hikvision surveillance cameras, which since January 2020 I've raised on more than 25 occasions in your Lordship's House, describing them as tools of genocide because of the way that their surveillance cameras have been used in Xinjiang to facilitate the atrocity crimes perpetrated against the Uyghurs. And as I said in a previous debate, a negligent procurement policy means that we will ultimately end up stripping them out, as we did with Huawei, at huge public cost. That is exactly what we have ended up doing. My lords, sometimes the government has done the right thing, but very late in the day, the decision to force a Chinese-owned tech firm to sell at least 86% of its stake in Britain's largest microchip company, Newport Wafer Fab, because of fears about the national security risks involved, was the right one. But why did we allow China to invest in such a critical sector in the very first place? And the mixed messaging continues. I applaud His Majesty's government for joining the US and Australia in forming AUKUS, our security alliance. But while this is the right response, there is plenty that isn't. During our International Relations and Defence Committee inquiry into China, the Noble Lord, Lord Patton of Barnes, using a word that my noble and gallant friend used himself in his own remarks today, described our approach to China as cakeism, wanting to be more secure while simultaneously wanting more trade deals. An example of that is the failure to sanction Hong Kong officials responsible for their involvement in some of the events described by the Noble Lord, Lord Patton. In January, 2 submissions on sanctions were made to the FCDO by Stand With Hong Kong and via the All-Party Group on Hong Kong and by Hong Kong Watch. In February, FCDO officials said the submissions would be reviewed and a decision made by April. There's still been no response, my lords, and perhaps the Noble Lord, particularly in the light of the growing number of political prisoners, there's more than 1,000 in prison in Hong Kong, will speak to his right honourable friend, Anne-Marie Trevelyan MP, to establish when a response will be forthcoming. And I've got some other questions. I'll try to be brief to the Noble Lord the Minister. Why was the Governor of Xinjiang invited to meet Foreign Office officials earlier this year? And why did it have to take public pressure for the visit to be cancelled? Why have not 1 but 2 Hong Kong ministers, the Secretary for Financial Services, Christopher Wai, and the then Financial Secretary, Paul Chan, been in London this year? When the CCP has completely dismantled Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy and undermined its rule of law, is that appropriate? Why was the first ministerial visit in 5 years by a British minister to Hong Kong made by the Trade Minister, the Noble Lord Lord Johnson, with no apparent agenda to discuss human rights, during the continued imprisonment of the British citizen Jimmy Lai, whose son Sebastian has been here in Parliament again this week? When is the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary going to follow the example of the US administration, the European Union Parliament and the United Nations Special Rapporteurs and call for the immediate release of Mr. Lai? And why did Lord Johnson speak at the Chinese Embassy's celebration of the 74th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China earlier this month? What kind of message does that send to a regime that the government itself says poses an epoch-defining systemic challenge? The Prime Minister gave a personal pledge to shut down the CCP's Confucius Institutes in our universities and schools. Why don't we work with the government of Taiwan for language and culture studies rather than the CCP? In January this year, The Times, following research by Civitas, highlighted the fact that more than 40 of our universities have links with institutions that are tools of the Chinese state, including institutions complicit with, facilitating or directly involved with the Uyghur genocide, nuclear development, military research, espionage and hacking. What are we thinking of? What steps are being taken, my lords, to help British universities reduce dependency and diversify their funding sources? And what is the government doing to address concerns highlighted by Charles Parton, a fellow of the Royal United Services Institute and others, that Chinese-made electric cars, or even simply Chinese-made cellular models that are components in non-Chinese-made cars and other electronic equipment, could be used to spy on us? What assessment has been made of those security risks? And why, following the physical assault by the Chinese Consul General in Manchester and several Chinese diplomats of Hong Kongers peacefully protesting outside the consulate, with the Consul General claiming it was his duty to do so, why didn't the government immediately expel those diplomats and declare them persona non grata? My Lords, it was instructive that Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles, a former British diplomat, who until recently was HSBC's head of public affairs, described Britain as weak for siding with the United States against China. But, my Lords, I would say we've been too weak in failing to stand up to the CCP. And if UK businesses are in any doubt about the nature of the regime with which they're dealing, they should meet Peter Humphreys, the British businessman and journalist who, at a meeting here recently, described his 2.5 years in Chinese jails, some of the time with 12 men in a cell. My Lords, to end, in response to this damning indictment from the Intelligence and Security Committee, we need to completely review our procurement policies, our university sector, our critical infrastructure and our diplomatic messaging, making sure we have the resources to counter the threat from the CCP and to ensure that we're consistent and robust in defending our values of human rights, our national interests and our national security.
Yeah.